It was one of those Oxford evenings that seemed stitched together from damp wool and faint bells. The rain had no urgency, only a patient insistence, clinging to the stone terraces and dripping from window boxes of neglected geraniums. I had walked alone from the station after a perfunctory day at HQ, the city moving past me like an old photograph I couldn't quite bring into focus. Somewhere behind the row of houses on Rawlinson Road, a postman pushed his bicycle along the gutter. I remember the squeal of the chain, the shape of his cap pulled low, and then, though I wasn't near enough to see it, I've always imagined the sound he heard. 2 slow knocks on a door painted a flaking green. Nothing followed. No shuffle of feet. No voice rising. Only rain and the small sigh of letterboxes receiving nothing. Later that night, when the constables called me, I would learn about the postman. But in that moment I was sitting in the snug of a little pub off Banbury Road, the one where the barman never tried to chat. I had my usual whiskey, a pint of something dark waiting beside it like a patient friend, and a book open to a poem by Houseman. A line caught my eye, familiar and wrong at the same time. Whoever had edited this edition had allowed a misprint. Not the hills of Shropshire, but the hills of silence, an error small enough to be overlooked, yet jarring once seen. I read it twice, then a third time, thinking of how a single wrong word can alter the whole drift of a stanza. The pub smelled of wet coats and old varnish. From somewhere behind the bar came a radio tuned to a college chapel broadcast. Distant treble voices rising in the Kyrie, blurred by static. I let my mind wander across the city, to the dripping cloisters, the bicycles abandoned under dripping porticos, the windows glowing faintly behind curtains. I thought of a woman alone in a terraced house, perhaps reading by a single lamp, not answering a knock. We all make our private refusals. The crossword in the evening paper lay folded beside me. Without quite knowing why, I worked through its clues, distracted by that misprinted poem. One clue read, "Double call without reply, 6. I penciled in silent, then hesitated. Something about the symmetry of it struck a chord. The 2 knocks, the unspoken answer, the misquotation. It was nothing, of course. At least then it was nothing. When I left the pub, the rain had grown finer, like a mist combed through the air. The pavements glistened under the weak glow of street lamps. My shoes made no sound on the wet stone. Somewhere a clock struck 9. I paused outside the Bodleian to smoke, feeling the city breathe in its peculiar way. Damp and learned, secretive, worn thin by centuries of footsteps. A patrol car passed slowly along Broad Street. In its brief glare, I glimpsed the postman again, far off, his bicycle glinting like a wet insect under the lamps. He was looking back over his shoulder at something I couldn't see, then pedaling on. Perhaps he heard the knocking still. Perhaps he heard nothing at all. I returned to my flat, carrying the crossword and the poem, both unfinished. On the landing, the bulb flickered, casting long, hesitant shadows. I thought again of that clue, of the misprint, of how 2 small errors could mirror each other across a city of scholars and secrets. In the quiet of my rooms, I poured another measure of whiskey and sat by the window, watching rain stripe the glass. If memory is a corridor, then that night is a door left slightly ajar. Behind it, a woman already absent. Behind it, the sound of knuckles on wood. And me, not yet summoned, but already listening. A week slid past like rain down a leaded pane. By the time the call reached me, the city had grown sharper in its cold, its lanes slick with late frost. I remember staring at the crossword in my kitchen and failing to fill a single square, a sure sign my mind was elsewhere. Strange's voice had carried a kind of rehearsed neutrality when he told me. A cleaning woman had raised the alarm in North Oxford. Same terraced street as before. Same green door. Curtains unmoved since Easter. When I arrived, The street was full of that muffled stillness that comes only when ordinary lives are temporarily displaced. Police tape sagged across the doorway. A cat sat under a dripping privet, tail flicking with faint irritation. Inside, the air smelled of damp paper and unaired carpet. The constable at the foot of the stairs murmured about natural causes, then stepped aside as though afraid of contaminating the stillness. Upstairs, Eleanor Stratfield lay as if abandoned mid-thought. The classics librarian, whom I had known only through footnotes and whispered rumors at the Bodleian, was now a pale figure beneath a tartan blanket, her glasses folded neatly on the nightstand. No sign of struggle, no bruise, no pill bottle carelessly left. Yet the room seemed arranged rather than lived in, like a stage awaiting its curtain. A book lay open on the counterpane, a minor Latin poet whose name I could never pronounce without self-consciousness. Between its pages, a slip of paper not unlike a library request form, covered in tight slanted symbols. Not Greek, not shorthand, but some personal cipher. I held it up to the window. Even reversed, it offered nothing but suggestion. But there was something about the placement, precisely page 42, precisely aligned with a passage on exile and return, that felt less like despair than declaration. Downstairs, the cleaning woman sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea someone had thrust at her. She kept saying the same thing, not to me, but to the cracked linoleum. Curtains never moved. I knocked twice last week, thought she was on holiday. Her words fell like slow drips from a leaking tap. I asked gently if anyone else had keys. She shook her head without looking up. Strange arrived then, bringing with him the faint smell of wet wool and impatience. He said it was a straightforward, sudden death and that the pathologist would confirm it soon enough. I heard myself reply that sudden deaths are rarely straightforward when the curtains are drawn for a week. He gave me one of his sideways looks, the one that says I'm indulging myself again. But he let me stay. I wandered through the sitting room, its books arranged alphabetically but with a strange interruption at the shelf of Hausmann. 2 editions stood side by side, one with a cracked spine. I drew it out and saw a faint pencil mark in the margin of the last poem. Not a word, but a small cross, as though someone had checked an answer off a list. A coincidence, perhaps, but the same gesture I had made on last week's crossword beside the clue double call without reply. I felt the echo of that evening in the pub. The misprinted stanza, the empty green door. Lewis joined me, quiet as always, and muttered that the neighbours had seen no visitors, though one mentioned a man in a grey coat loitering by the hedge. He looked at me as if to ask whether it meant anything. I said only that loitering is Oxford's oldest pastime. But the image clung, a shape outside, 2 knocks, a week of silence. When we left, the cat was still under the privet, its eyes reflecting the blue of the police lights. I walked back to my car slowly, the coded slip in my pocket, aware of its weightless insistence. Natural causes might end a life, but they do not usually arrange the stage so carefully or leave a cipher as curtain call. That night in my flat, I unfolded the paper again under my lamp. The symbols swam like reeds in a current. Outside, the bells marked another hour lost. I thought of Eleanor Stratfield's unopened curtains and felt, not for the first time, the faint prickle of a case already speaking in whispers, if only I could learn its language. By the 3rd day after Eleanor's death, the city had begun to thaw, and yet my mind moved more slowly than the river beneath Folly Bridge. Lewis and I sat in my office staring at a thin folder of her life, the facts already curling at the edges. The official note from headquarters spoke of a solitary classics librarian with no immediate family, yet her correspondence, neat envelopes, scented faintly of some old-fashioned soap, told of quiet gatherings at a riverside inn. I had passed that inn 100 times, its windows glowing like lanterns across the water, never suspecting it was a stage for anything more than mild gossip and stale beer. Lewis read out the names one by one as though drawing cards from a deck. a junior lecturer in Latin epigraphy, recently appointed and already angling for a chair beyond his reach. A bursar, widowed last winter, debts coiled around his accounts like ivy round a pillar. A former lover of Eleanor's who had abandoned the Bodleian stacks for the anonymity of uniform and badge, now stationed in Reading, I noted with some ironic admiration, and a woman who entered the Bodleian under a name not her own, making notes in the margins of books she did not borrow. All four had been present at those weekly meetings. All four, like stones on a riverbed, half buried but glinting. The inn itself was quiet when we arrived. Mid-morning, a weak sun spilling across the water. Inside, the smell of beer, wood polish, and the faint salt of river damp. The landlady, her hair pinned in a way that made me think of vanished decades, said they were book club of sorts. She said this without conviction, eyes sliding to the ledger on the counter. She had not expected us, yet her hands rested protectively on the pages, as though they contained something private. I asked if I might glance at the register. She hesitated, then turned it towards me. A page of initials, nothing more. Yet as I traced them with my finger, I saw a rhythm, not alphabetical, not by date, but in pairs. 2 letters repeated at odd intervals, as if signaling a private understanding. The bursar's initials appeared alongside the junior lecturer's in one entry and alongside the mysterious woman's in another, never alone. Eleanor's own initials surfaced only 3 times, each adjacent to the former lover's and always on the first Monday of the month. Lewis leaned over my shoulder and said he saw nothing but untidy scribbles. I told him he was probably right and shut the book, but in my pocket I sketched the pattern on the back of an old crossword. The clue at the top of the page read, "Circle without end, 5." I penciled in "loop," then struck it out. There was something else hidden there, a shape not yet clear, but insistent. We spoke briefly with the landlady. She said Eleanor drank cider and never stayed late. She said the junior lecturer liked to pay in cash. The bursar always left before the final bell. The mysterious woman never gave a surname. All details delivered like crumbs swept from a table. Nothing directly incriminating, but in her voice a faint tremor. Not fear, more like pity. Outside, the river moved on, carrying bits of blossom and wrappers from some student picnic. Lewis asked if I thought they were a cabal, or merely lonely souls with a taste for Latin verse. I told him the two were not mutually exclusive. He smiled at that, but said nothing more. Back in the car, I unfolded the crossword sketch and added one more mark beside the bursar's initials. The pattern now resembled a closed circle with a small break near the top, like a keyhole. I did not know yet what it opened, only that Eleanor had stood at its threshold. That night, in the quiet of my flat, I stared at the page until the lines blurred. The city outside was full of voices I could not quite hear, the echo of oars on dark water. Somewhere in those initials, a story waited, folded like a letter never sent. I can still feel the weight of that afternoon in my hands. The brittle paper, the smell of dust and long closed drawers. Eleanor's papers had been moved to a spare room at the station, stacked without ceremony. Yet as I lifted each folder, I sensed the faint resistance of a life arranged with care. Lewis had gone off to cajole a timetable from the bursar, leaving me alone with the quiet hiss of the radiator and a drizzle pressing against the window. I began with the obvious, the coded slip from her bedside, the library books she had signed out, the letters she kept bundled in faded ribbon. At first, nothing but the expected minutiae of an academic life. Grant forms, lecture notes, polite refusals to conferences. Then, half hidden among them, an envelope addressed in the bursar's careful hand. I unfolded it and read without expectation, only to be halted by a line that rang oddly against my memory. It was from Houseman, or supposed to be. Yet the rhythm stumbled. Where the hills should have been shining, here they were silent. The same error I had noticed in the misprinted edition at the pub. The same quiet substitution that had caught at me like a thorn. Eleanor would never misquote Houseman. She had annotated an entire commentary on his meters, and the bursar, though cultured enough, lacked the scholar's instinct for precise cadence. I set the letter beside the note from her bedroom. 2 different hands, 2 different contexts, yet the same false line threaded through both like a hair through milk. Coincidence has its limits. I remember thinking of the crossword folded in my pocket. That day's clue read, "Poet's slip reveals a stranger's hand." 7. I had filled in erratum with a flick of my pencil, then crossed it out. Now the words seemed to hover over the papers before me. A slip can be a misprint, but it can also be a mask. Lewis returned then, smelling of rain and university corridors. He muttered that the bursar had been helpful enough, though quick to defend his reputation. I asked what he had actually said. That he had admired Eleanor's mind, but rarely saw her, Lewis replied, glancing at the papers as though they might contradict him. Did he seem nervous? I asked. Only the way any man might when a police officer digs at old friendships, he said. I didn't answer. My attention had drifted to a faint pencil mark on the envelope. A cross in the upper corner, almost erased. Not an initial, not a date. A sign of filing, perhaps, or something more deliberate. Eleanor had catalogued books for decades. She used symbols sparingly and with meaning. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the sash window. I thought of her small house with its drawn curtains, the slip of paper aligned to exile and return, and now this double misquotation like an echo across rooms. Forgery or code. The words felt interchangeable in that moment. Lewis asked if I wanted tea. I shook my head and watched him leave again. Alone, I reread the bursar's letter slowly, tasting each word, imagining his pen hovering over the line from Houseman and choosing to leave it wrong. Or had someone else inserted the error, anticipating my attention? The more I stared, the more the page blurred until only the false word remained, shining like a pinprick of light. When I left the room, I slipped the letter and the bedside note into my coat pocket. The corridor smelled of damp plaster and disinfectant, yet beneath it a trace of old paper clung to my fingers. In the car, I unfolded the crossword and wrote the misquoted line in the margin, next to the unfinished clue. The drizzle had thickened into rain, each drop striking the windscreen like a slow metronome. I remember thinking not of suspects, but of cadence. How a single wrong note can announce the presence of a hidden composer. Eleanor, meticulous to the end, had left me that wrong note. Whether by design or accident, it had begun to sing. It was a raw evening when Lewis and I returned to the street, the same rain-smudged terrace where the green door still bore a faint outline of police tape. A week of drizzle had dulled the bricks to the color of ash, and the privet hedge sagged under beads of water like an old rosary. The case had grown quiet in the papers, a single paragraph fading between council notices, but here the air held its own aftertaste of watching. We went first to the house opposite. A woman in a wool shawl opened the door just wide enough to regard us. She smelled faintly of paraffin and bread dough, her eyes wary yet curious. She said she had seen a man that night. Tweed coat, collar turned up, a shape half hidden by rain, standing at Eleanor's door. 2 knocks, slow, not the kind of tapping one makes to hurry a friend. She thought perhaps he left a parcel but saw nothing in his hands. She added that the cat had bristled on her windowsill, which she took as confirmation of an intruder. I asked what time this was. She said after the chapel bells, but before the buses stopped, which could mean almost anything. Did she notice the man's face? No, only the back of his head, a grey smear beneath the street lamp. I thanked her, and she closed the door softly, as though sealing away her own uncertainty. Across the street, another neighbor opened to us, a retired don with nicotine-stained fingers who wore his dressing gown like a toga. He waved aside the idea of a visitor. No one came that night, he insisted. He had been reading Thucydides by the fire, and the only sound was the rain. If there had been knocking, he would have heard it. The acoustics of the terrace were like a cathedral. He gave a small academic smile at his own metaphor, then looked at me as though daring me to contradict his memory. Back outside, the street felt narrower, lined with two incompatible versions of the past. 2 knocks, or none at all. A man in tweed, or no one. Lewis muttered that people hear what they expect to hear, but his tone lacked conviction. We walked slowly toward the corner shop, its neon flicker a small defiance against the dusk. Inside, amid stacked newspapers and the smell of damp cardboard, Lewis picked up a discarded crossword from the local evening paper. He tapped a finger on a clue halfway down the grid. Silent answer to double call. 6. The same shape of thought that had been circling me for days. He grinned faintly and asked if I wanted it. I said nothing, only reached out and tore the clue from the page with a careful rip, folding it into my coat pocket as if it were a scrap of evidence. We walked back along the river path, the water swollen and brown under the rain. Students hurried past with their collars up, oblivious. I found myself recalling the bursar's letter, the misquoted line, the initials at the inn. Patterns forming, yet always just beyond reach, like the reflection of a light that breaks when you try to touch it. Lewis asked if I believed the first neighbor. I told him belief was a poor tool for an investigator. Rhythm was better. 2 knocks and no answer. A misprinted poem, a crossword clue about silence. He gave me a sideways glance, but didn't press. At home later, I spread the torn clue beside my own scribbled notes. The ink had bled slightly from the damp of my coat, softening the letters. Outside the window, the bells tolled again, their sound absorbed by the wet night. I thought of Eleanor Stratfield's green door, now shut to everyone, and the man who may or may not have stood before it. 2 stories like twin echoes, both incomplete. In the quiet, the clue stared back at me, a small square of print heavier than it should have been. Silent answer to double call. Some puzzles begin with the question, others with the echo. I remember the first of those interviews as one remembers a dream in fragments. A smell, a glance, a half-finished sentence. By then the rain had receded into a low, colorless sky, leaving the streets rinsed and gleaming. Oxford under weak sunlight can look almost forgiving, but that day its facades felt like masks drawn tight. I had begun to suspect that what linked Eleanor to her little circle at the inn was not scholarship alone, but something quieter, more compromising. The bursar received me in his panelled office, the air thick with furniture polish and old paper. He stood as I entered, hands clasped as though to still their trembling. He spoke of Eleanor in the respectful tones reserved for the departed, his words arranged like chess pieces, each safe but calculated. I asked when he had last seen her. At a faculty meeting, he said. He had left early for an appointment and then travelled to Reading to visit his daughter. He named the train, the carriage, the ticket inspector, as if anticipating a cross-examination. His alibi was not merely solid, it was rehearsed, an actor's script delivered without falter. As he talked, a small framed photograph on his desk caught my eye. Not the usual family tableau, but a blurred image of a college dinner years earlier. I recognized Eleanor at the edge of the frame, her smile turned slightly inward. The bursar's hand rested lightly on the back of her chair, his face fixed in an expression between pride and possession. He noticed my glance and shifted the frame so that the reflection of the window obscured it. He said she had been a brilliant librarian, but a solitary woman. He said nothing of closeness. When I left, the quadrangle smelled of cut grass and the faint iron tang of old gutters. Lewis waited by the gate, his notebook closed. He asked what I thought. That some rehearsals are too perfect, I murmured, and we walked on. Later that afternoon, I spoke with a senior porter who had been at the same dinner. His memory drifted like cigarette smoke, but he recalled a scene near the end. Eleanor rising to speak, the bursar reaching to stop her, a hush falling over the table. No one quite remembered her words, only the silence that followed. She had left the college soon after for a sabbatical. The porter shrugged as though such things were common. Perhaps they are, I thought, but their echoes can travel far. We turned next to the junior lecturer. His room smelled of damp wool and coffee grounds, papers spread like a fan across his desk. He spoke eagerly of his research on disputed inheritances in Roman law, dropping names of grants and committees as though sprinkling charms. When I asked about Eleanor, his tone flattened to polite distance. He had met her at the inn, yes. She had advised him on some cataloguing work, yes. Nothing more. Yet among his papers lay a draft grant proposal with a footnote in Eleanor's handwriting, crisp and unmistakable. It cited a will she had been cataloguing for the college archives, the very will now under dispute between two benefactors. I traced the marginal note with a finger, feeling the indentation of her pen. The lecturer shifted in his chair, suddenly remembering an errand. On the bus back to the station, Lewis asked whether the bursar's alibi impressed me. I said it impressed me the way a stage set does. Solid until you lean against it. He smiled faintly, used to my metaphors. I unfolded the day's crossword from my pocket. One clue read, "Lover's retreat becomes scholar's ruin. 8. I penciled in sanctity, then crossed it out, unsure. The letters would not yet arrange themselves. That night in my flat, I poured a small whiskey and looked at the photograph I'd taken of the bursar's frame before he shifted it. Eleanor's half-smile stared back at me, the bursar's hand poised like a shadow. Some affairs end quietly. Others leave a rhythm one can still hear years later, if only faintly. The rain had returned by the time Lewis and I crossed the quad, a fine diagonal mist drifting under the arches, softening the carved Latin mottos until they looked like chalk smudges. The porter had left the archive keys in a brown envelope for us. Even the weight of that paper felt conspiratorial. We walked in silence to the college library, our footsteps swallowed by the wet stone. Inside the archive, the air was heavy with the perfume of old bindings and a faint, metallic tang from the radiator pipes. The room had the hush of a crypt. One spoke without intending to lower the voice. We spread Eleanor's coded note across the long oak table, its edges curled like a dry leaf. The superficial decoding, a simple substitution cipher Lewis had worked out on a bus ride, produced a message too neat to ignore. Junior lecturer, rare volumes, concealment. It read like a fragment from a disciplinary report. Lewis muttered that it fit everything. The grant proposal, the marginal notes in Eleanor's hand, the lecturer's nervousness. He asked if I thought we had him. I said only that ciphers, like crosswords, can offer the answer you want before you deserve it. We requested from the archive assistant the borrowing records for the restricted cases. She brought them with an air of mild irritation, as if we were interrupting the natural order of dust. We traced each entry, my finger stopping at the junior lecturer's signature, or rather initials, appearing twice beside a locked cabinet of 16th century theological treatises. The dates coincided with Eleanor's absences. Lewis pointed to the entries, his pencil tapping with restrained triumph. He said this proves he was in and out when she wasn't looking. I asked him to imagine instead that she had arranged for him to be there. He frowned, the pencil stilled. On the far wall, a corkboard held photographs from a recent college exhibition. Among them, an enlarged black and white of an old-school prize-giving. Eleanor stood at the edge, barely 20, eyes already distant. 2 rows behind her, a boy whose face resembled the junior lecturer's stood with a hand on a trophy. It could have been him. It could have been a cousin. The image unsettled me without clarifying why. I leaned closer to the photograph, ignoring the archive assistant's sigh. The boy's tie bore a crest from a school that had closed decades ago. The lecturer would have been a child then. The timeline faltered. The cipher's implication wobbled like a badly set compass. Back at the table, I unfolded the day's crossword, seeking some steadiness in its grids. One clue read, "Door that leads nowhere." 5. I penciled in false, then rubbed it out, then wrote it again. The letters looked stark against the white. Lewis asked what was wrong. I said the cipher was too eager, like a door propped invitingly open in a corridor you've never walked before. He said perhaps we were being cautious to a fault. I didn't answer. My eyes kept returning to the boy's tie, the closed school, the gap in the pattern. We thanked the assistant and left with our copies. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the stones were slick, and the gargoyles overhead dripped like slow clocks. Lewis said he would draft a report naming the lecturer as a suspect. I told him to wait. He asked why. Because doors can be built to mislead, I said, and some open on to nothing. In my flat later that night, I laid the cipher and the photograph side by side. The words accusing the junior lecturer looked suddenly theatrical, like a line from a play read out of order. The boy in the photograph stared past me into a future he could not yet inhabit. I poured a small whiskey, the glass trembling slightly against the wood. The room smelled faintly of wet paper from the documents in my coat. I remember thinking that false solutions have their own kind of truth. They reveal how easily a mind can be steered. And mine, though practiced, had almost walked through that door. The inn sat low by the river like a thought half buried. Rain had softened its sign to a blur of gold letters. Reeds swayed against the stone steps where punts once waited for students in summer. I arrived just after noon, the tide of tourists long gone, leaving the place with its own small echo. Inside, the smell of coal dust and old beer pressed close. The windows were steamed and the fire snapped with a weak, patient sound. The landlady emerged from a back passage carrying a tray of glasses. Her hair was pinned in the same practical way as before, but I sensed she had recognized me at once. She asked if I was still working on that sad business. I said only that some questions grow quieter but not simpler. She set the tray down and looked at me with a flicker of something, curiosity or caution. I asked about Eleanor's visits here years before. She said there had been a retreat of scholars who rented the upstairs rooms. One night, she remembered, the corridor smelled of wet wool, and someone was crying in a locked room. A woman in a dark coat had gone up and knocked twice on Eleanor's door, not briskly, but almost like a code. No one answered. The woman waited, then went away. The landlady never learned her name. She told this as though reading from an old playbill, her eyes on a spot beyond my shoulder. I thanked her. She shrugged, but her hands were restless on the counter. "People come and go," she said, "and most leave nothing." I asked if she still had the guest book from that time. She vanished into the back room and returned with a ledger brittle at the edges. The ink had faded to a brown whisper. The entry for that night showed initials only, ES beside two others, one a curving M that could belong to any number of names. When she went to serve a customer, I carried my pint to a corner table near the window. The river outside moved sluggishly, carrying fragments of blossom and a single plastic bag that clung to a mooring post like a ghostly flag. I took out the bursar's letter from my coat and unfolded it. The paper had grown soft at the creases. A small radio behind the bar was tuned to some classical program, the signal fraying in and out. Through the static emerged Schubert, a fragment from the Notturno, that slow, triple-time heartbeat. I had heard it before, but could not place where until now. It was the same piece faintly audible on the recording of Eleanor's telephone message, a detail I had almost ignored. The melody drifted through the bar like breath through a keyhole, and a phrase from the letter lifted from the page to meet it. I reread the passage slowly. Between two innocuous sentences lay a line whose rhythm matched the Schubert, not the rest of the prose. The bursar's careful hand had embedded something. A second message or an echo meant only for someone who would hear it. The words looked ordinary, but their cadence was off, as though a foreign tongue had been pressed into English. Lewis arrived then, shaking rain from his coat, and asked if I had found anything. I said perhaps, but that it was like trying to read a watermark in failing light. He nodded and ordered tea. We sat in silence, listening to the piano's hesitant ascent and fall, the radio crackling like an old fire. When we left, the sky had turned a pale pewter, and the river carried our reflections like blurred handwriting. I slipped the letter back into my pocket, aware that it now weighed more than paper. Some signals are not meant to be loud. They depend on being heard in the right bar on the right afternoon, with Schubert threading the air. It was late when the pattern finally began to stir beneath the surface, like silt unsettled by an oar. I had returned from the inn with the bursar's letter damp in my pocket, Schubert's fragment still clinging to my ears. The flat smelled of wet wool and old paper from my coat, a scent that seemed to bind Eleanor's absence to my own solitude. I poured a small whiskey and set out the pieces on the table, the coded note, the misquoted line, the torn crossword clue from the local paper. 2 knocks without reply. Silent answer to double call. The phrases circled each other like moths, faintly lit. I stared at the note again, at the neat slanted symbols Lewis had been so sure meant theft. The surface decoding pointed to the junior lecturer, but the cadence of the cipher, its rhythm of twos and pauses, matched something else. A pattern of marginalia I had seen in Eleanor's cataloguing hand, always marking paired volumes of a single text, the way some librarians mark copies destined for different shelves. I opened the bursar's letter once more. The false houseman line glared from the middle, but this time I read beyond it, tracing the capital letters at the start of each sentence. They spelled out a phrase in Latin I knew only dimly: clavis duplicem, double key. In the margins of the letter, a faint dot beside 2 separate references to wills, one public, one private, both tied to a disputed bequest. I found myself pulling down from my own shelf an old catalogue Eleanor had compiled years before. The index contained an inscription from a donor who had left the college, 2 estates, one acknowledged and one rumored. In the flyleaf was a small pocket, the sort that once held borrowing slips. Empty now, but when I pressed my thumb along the edge it gave slightly, as though something had been slid in and removed. 2 knocks, 2 wills. A key hidden in plain sight. Lewis had gone home hours earlier. The room was quiet except for the faint hiss of rain at the window. I felt the peculiar lift of deduction, that moment when disparate fragments arrange themselves without effort, yet also the weight of what such clarity can mean. If Eleanor had discovered a secret bequest and hidden the key inside a book, who else had known, and whose hands had copied her misquotation, embedding it as a sign? I poured another measure and sat back, letting the whiskey's heat rise slowly. In the glass, the streetlights blurred like candle flames. My thoughts drifted to Eleanor herself, the solitary dinners, the unspoken humiliation at the college feast, the silent answering machine. She had left her clues like small lanterns, but no map. Perhaps she had known I would follow the wrong path first, had counted on it even. Outside, the bells marked the hour with a hollow sound. I unfolded the crossword again, smoothing its creases. The clue door that leads nowhere, 5, stared at me from the margin where I had written false, then rubbed it out, then written it again. Tonight it looked different, as though the door did not lead nowhere but back to her. In the stillness, I imagined the bursar rehearsing his alibi on the train, reciting the inspector's name, the ticket time, the platform number. Too perfect, like an actor too eager to impress. I pictured his hand hovering over Eleanor's door years ago, perhaps knocking twice in some private plea. The whiskey burned a little at the back of my throat. I do not remember turning off the lamp, only sitting there with the papers spread before me, the Schubert fragment running again in my head, the sense of a key waiting in some forgotten flyleaf. 2 knocks, 2 wills, 2 lives, hers and mine, both folded inward. In that hour, the case felt less like an investigation than a mirror. I can still see the bursar's office as it was that afternoon, a chamber of muted mahogany and pale winter light, dust motes rising like suspended questions. The college had emptied for the holidays. Even the pigeons on the roof seemed subdued. I had carried the folder under my arm as though it were a verdict. Inside lay the altered will and the letter with its false houseman line, the 2 knocks of evidence I had pieced together through sleepless evenings. He stood behind his desk when I entered, hands clasped too tightly. He did not ask me to sit. I laid the documents on the green leather blotter, their edges aligned like chessmen. I said nothing at first. Silence can be an opening move. At length, he murmured that he had expected this visit. He looked older than his years, the skin about his eyes folded with fatigue rather than cunning. I began gently. The will in its public form and the secret codicil Eleanor had found. The forged quotation that appeared in both his letter and the note beside her bed. The key hidden in the book's flyleaf. He listened, without interruption, only once lifting a hand to his temple as though to steady a tremor. Then he spoke, voice low and uneven. "It was not greed," he said. Eleanor had discovered an old scandal, one that involved his late wife and a mismanaged trust fund from decades ago. If revealed, it would have cast a long shadow over his daughter's new post at the university. He had begged Eleanor to remain silent. She had refused. He swore he found her already dead that night, the light still burning in the window, and that in panic he had staged the scene to look like a scholar's sudden collapse, hoping to bury both truths at once. He met my eyes, only briefly. I saw not calculation, but a kind of exhausted shame. He said he had not touched her, had not harmed her, only rearranged papers, turned a book face down, closed curtains. He had thought of it as shielding his family, not deceiving the police. I asked where he had been at the precise hour of her death. He repeated the alibi, the train, the ticket inspector, the visit to Reading, but the cadence had lost its polish. Small hesitations broke the flow, like missed notes in a familiar piece. I felt the pattern fray beneath his words. Lewis stood quietly near the door, saying nothing. His presence was like a second conscience, and I sensed his unease. The bursar spoke again, softer now. "If you must charge me, do so quickly, but leave my daughter's name out." I closed the folder without answering. The room seemed to tighten around us, the ticking of the radiator pipes the only sound. On his desk lay a newspaper folded to the crossword. Without thinking, I glanced at it. The clue at the top of the column read, "Daughter's future hidden in father's past." 9. I penciled in redemption, then crossed it out. The letters would not settle. When we left the office, the quad was empty, puddles shining like spilled ink. Lewis asked what I believed. I told him belief was a luxury. Patterns were what mattered. We still did not know where the junior lecturer had been that night, and absence can be as telling as presence. That evening I sat alone in my flat, whiskey in hand, listening to the muted hum of the city beyond the window. The papers lay spread before me like an unfinished score. Eleanor's solitary life pressed at me. Her precision, her refusals, the quiet courage of her misquotation. I thought of the bursar's daughter, of the way secrets echo across generations, and of my own long silences. Outside, the bells tolled, their sound dissolving into the damp air. I did not yet know what the next move would be, only that the case had shifted again, leaving a hollow where certainty should have been, and that the second knock still waited to be answered. It was a morning that felt like evening, the sky the color of wet paper. I'd come to the chapel not to pray but to listen, though I would not have admitted it aloud. The junior lecturer was rehearsing a reading for some college service, his voice drifting between the pews like pale smoke. The chapel smelled of polish and stone dust, of old hymns that had dried into the wood. I sat near the back, coat still damp from the walk across the quad, notebook closed on my knee. He began with a Latin passage familiar to me from Eleanor's shelves. His tone was confident but oddly mechanical, as if each word had been memorized from a transcription rather than absorbed. When he reached a line from Houseman, translated into Latin for some half-forgotten reason, he stumbled. Not a pause exactly, but a faint shift of vowel, the same slip embedded in the bursar's letter and the note from Eleanor's bedside. It was a small fracture, the sort only a pedant would hear. Yet in that moment the pattern completed itself, with a sound like a lock turning. I watched him close the book and glance at the empty choir stalls, unaware of me in the shadows. His hands were steady, but his shoulders had a tautness that belonged to neither scholarship nor devotion. He bent to gather his papers, and in that gesture, brief and unguarded, I saw the same rhythm of twos, the tapping of his fingers, the flick of his eyes toward the side door. A signal, once given at Eleanor's house, now repeating itself unconsciously. Outside, the rain began again, a muted drumming on the leaded windows. I stayed seated, letting the echo of his mispronunciation settle inside me. The forged quotation, the altered will, the bursar's panicked staging, these had been pieces of a puzzle whose picture I had refused to see. The double knock was never the bursar's plea for entry, but the lecturer's test of absence. He came down the aisle, head bowed over his notes. I rose as he reached the nave. We spoke quietly, almost formally, about the weather, about the service, about nothing at all. His eyes flickered only once when I mentioned Eleanor's name. He asked if the investigation was closing soon. I said the shape of it was clearer than before, though clarity can be cruel. He gave a small smile that did not reach his eyes and left through the side door into the rain. I remained in the pew, fingers resting on the worn wood. The crossword folded in my pocket, pressed against my thigh like a pulse. I took it out and smoothed the creases. The clue I had left blank the night before, Red Knocker's second intent, 6. Without hesitation, I penciled in murder, then rubbed it out until the paper thinned. Some truths are too stark to leave in ink. The organist arrived, nodding to me as he passed, and began a slow Schubert prelude. The notes rose and fell in that familiar triple-time heartbeat. I closed my eyes and thought of Eleanor, of the bursar's daughter, of the quiet courage hidden in a misquotation. The chapel's dim light made everything seem older, as if I were remembering a memory. When at last I stepped outside, the rain had thickened into a fine mist. The quad lay empty, puddles reflecting the chapel's stained glass like smudged confessions. I walked slowly back to my flat, the torn crossword in my pocket, the weight of understanding heavier than the case itself. That night, whiskey in hand, I wrote nothing in my report. I sat at the window watching the city's lamps blur, thinking of Eleanor's green door, of the signal that had opened it for a killer, of the silences we all keep to survive. The case was solved in outline, yet it felt less like victory than an echo fading in stone corridors. It happened in a small committee room off the cloisters, the kind of room where minutes are taken and reputations altered without a raised voice. The junior lecturer sat opposite me at the narrow table, hands folded, eyes lowered to the wood grain as though reading a text only he could see. Outside the window, the quad was a wash of slate and drizzle, students moving like blurred footnotes between lectures. He spoke before I asked a question. His voice had none of the bravado of our first encounters, only a muted steadiness, almost a relief. He said he had not meant to harm her, Not at first. He had needed the codicil to secure the grant, to prove some intricate point of Roman law that would catapult him out of the limbo of adjunct status. Eleanor had promised to help, but then had drawn back. She had called him reckless. Pride and ambition had twisted into resentment. Betrayal had arrived like an aftertaste. He paused, fingers pressing against the table edge, and said he had gone to her house that night only to plead. I listened without interruption. The air in the room had the sour warmth of old carpet. He described knocking twice, the old signal from their meetings at the inn. She had not answered. He said he had entered through the unlocked door, words rising, then something breaking inside him. His account became halting, evasive. What followed was a blur of accusation and struggle that left Eleanor collapsed on the stairs. He said he had fled, then returned later to rearrange the room so the bursar would appear entangled. His tone was not self-pitying, but strangely precise, like a scholar presenting a flawed thesis. Lewis stood near the door, notebook closed. He asked if the bursar had known. The lecturer shook his head, a gesture small enough to miss, and said the older man's panic had been useful but unplanned. He spoke of ambition as though it were an infection, of betrayal as though it were mutual. His voice thinned to a whisper. I thought I could keep my hands clean. For a moment, the silence thickened. Rain tapped at the leaded panes. Somewhere a bell struck the hour. I glanced at the crossword folded in my pocket, the clue from the day before still unanswered. Scholars rise ends and scholars fall. 7. Without taking it out, I wrote the letters in my mind. Latinus, then erased them mentally, then left the square blank. When it was done, when he had signed the statement, I walked out alone through the side door into the cloister. The drizzle had deepened to a fine mist that coated my coat and hair, softening the stone underfoot. Students hurried past with their collars up, oblivious to the quiet unraveling of one of their own inside. Crossing the quad, I thought of Eleanor's careful handwriting, her misquotation like a breadcrumb, the bursar's staged alibi, the lecturer's 2 knocks. I thought of how easily scholarship and solitude can shade into secrecy, how pride becomes a private chamber whose door sticks from the inside. At the gate I paused under the arch, watching water gather in the worn steps. The college smelled of wet books and old heating pipes, of lives arranged and rearranged behind curtains. I felt no triumph, only the dull ache of recognition, the price of solitude, the fragility of reputation. These were not abstractions, but conditions I carried as well. I walked away without looking back, the drizzle seeping into my cuffs, the city's bells muffled by mist. In my pocket, the crossword lay folded, its empty square a small silence I could not yet fill. Some doors, once closed, never truly open again.